The laws which this science sets out to find are relations between these two supposed aspects, and hence can themselves be nothing more than empty subjective opinions. Also, since the object of this supposed way of knowing which takes it upon itself to deal with the reality of spirit is just the reflection of spirit out of its sensuous existence back into itself, and a particular physical existence is for spirit something indifferent and contingent, this kind of knowing must be directly aware that the laws it has discovered tell us nothing, that strictly speaking it is idle chatter or merely the voicing of one's own opinion. An expression which contains the truth about itself, that is, that it is one's own opinion that is put forward, hence not the matter itself, but merely an opinion of one's own. As regards their content, however, these observations are on par with these. It always rains when we have our annual fair, says the dealer, and every time, too, says the housewife, when I am drying my washing. After having made what we could call a good faith effort to see whether one of the pseudosciences of his own time, physiognomy, and he's also going to talk about phrenology, can actually make good on its promises and follow out the current of, or the implications of its premises, Hegel now is been on the attack, but he's going even further on the attack. He is going to isolate something that turns out to be very important and is going to show up in some of the other passages following this. So the question is whether anything like a real law, something that provides intelligibility, regularity, and understanding of the relationship between cause and effect, or in this case, what is being expressed and its expression, in living human beings, in acting subjects, whether anything like that is really provided by physiognomy. And the answer, of course, is no. But why is the answer no? That's where we get to something more interesting. So he says the laws that this science sets out to find would be relations between these two supposed aspects, right? So we're not getting anything like what physiognomy is purporting to provide us with, which is the relationship between the inner and the outer, a relationship that actually works its way backwards because we observe the outer and we draw conclusions from that outer about the inner of a given person or a class of people. A lot of notions of race prevalent at the time were drawing upon this sort of conception. Class also fits in with this. Oftentimes race and class would get conflated in very sloppy ways we can now recognize. And what's really going on here? So Hegel puts his finger on it. He says, what we have here are really nothing more than empty subjective opinions. Now notice the term that's being translated here as opinion is meinen. This is something that we encountered already back in the consciousness section when we saw that there was a distinction between the meinen, or intending, or trying to say something, and it's always got a sort of connotation of individuality or particularity or subjectivity. And what was actually universal? It could be language, right? Language, you try to make up a word that expresses exactly what you want. Well, if you make up a word and nobody else expresses things using that word, the word is totally worthless, right? You may as well be doing a gesture. Here, we don't even have a gesture. We have something of the outward form that is being used. And what's connecting them together is, as Hegel's saying, empty subjective opinion. Whose opinion? The opinion of the person engaging in physiognomy. It's kind of made up ad hoc by drawing conclusions, making inferences that are ultimately going to be based on opinion, like the ones that he finishes up with saying, they're on a par, these observations, with these sorts of observations. The dealer says, it always rains when we have our annual fair. And then the housewife responds, and every time too when I'm drying my washing. Now, what's the implication? Does it really rain every time that they have their annual fair? No, the person is saying something that may have some sort of basis in their experience, but they're drawing some pretty unfounded conclusions from them. The housewife is also getting involved in it because it's fun to express oneself. It's fun to connect things together, even if there isn't a real connection there. And so she says, yeah, every time that I do my wash, it rains, because you'd have to do your wash outside and also hang your stuff to dry outside. Now, this is very problematic. So he goes on and he says, the object of this supposed way of knowing, which takes upon itself to deal with the reality of spirit, that's what law is supposed to be providing us with here, because we're not talking about laws of electricity or organic life as such. We're talking about laws that pertain to human beings, as agents, as things that have an interior side to them and which express themselves through their bodies in externalizations of some sort. And the question is, well, what sort of externalization should we be looking at or looking to? So he goes on and he says, because this is supposed to deal with the reality of spirit, it's just the reflection of spirit out of its sensuous existence back into itself. And a particular physical existence is for spirit something indifferent and contingent. What are we talking about there? Well, any given body is something contingent. So if we're looking at the outer, and we're looking at maybe 10 outers, right? Think about this. If we're drawing conclusions based on the physiognomy, or there's other ways of doing that as well, based on the outward shape or form, or configuration, or perhaps, we might even say the genetics of just a few people, how much can we really conclude from that? Are we going too far when we draw fairly sweeping conclusions based on that? That's a good question. So he goes on and he says, because of this kind of knowing must be directly aware that the laws it has discovered tell us nothing. So they're not really laws at all. They're not providing us with what laws are supposed to provide us with. He says, strictly speaking, it becomes idle chatter. It becomes the sort of thing that people just say, around the proverbial water cooler. Not too many businesses have water coolers these days, but you get the idea. They sit in the coffee shop and people chatter about, mankind and politics and what people, of this sort do and what people of that sort do. And they draw sweeping conclusions that can't really be supported. And they do it based on people's appearance, their body, their face. So he goes on and he says, it's idle chatter or merely the voicing of one's own opinion. And we ought to think about what Hegel has to say here. In our culture, we often get the message that our opinion matters because it's our opinion, right? And everybody has opinions. We also get the message that opinions are like a certain part of our body. Everybody's got them, and something often comes out of them, right? But all too often we get told that our opinion matters because it is our opinion. Hegel says, no, not at all. Your opinion matters if it's expressing something that's connected in some way with the universal. It doesn't have to be necessarily universal as such, but it better be more than just your mere opinion, or else what are you doing? You're asserting yourself over against other subjectivities and saying that they ought to see things the way that you do. They ought to believe in these laws because you've drawn a few conclusions in your idle chatter about what somebody's appearance is and what that has to say about them. And then you go on and generalize about other people. Oh, the criminal type, I can tell them by looking at them. Oh, I can tell that person is promiscuous and likely to cheat by the way that they appear. Well, you don't actually know much of anything if you're drawing it from just a few circumstances, even if you have a case where that person was a cheater and they looked a certain way. right? This is one of the fundamental problems. So he says, what does one's own opinion tell us? It contains the truth of itself in that expression, that it is one's own opinion that is put forward, not the matter itself, but merely an opinion of one's own. And so we get to these things like, oh, it always rains when the fair is on. It always rains too when I'm doing my wash. These generalizations are not even real generalizations. And so we have to be very careful in talking about appearance and what that indicates to us about human being. Lichtenberg, who characterizes physiognomic observation in this way, also says this: if anyone said, "You certainly act like an honest man, but I see from your face that you are forcing yourself to do so and are a rogue at heart," without a doubt every honest fellow to the end of time when thus addressed will retort with a box on the ear. This retort is to the point because it refutes the primary assumption of such a science of mere subjective opinion. That is, that the reality of a man is his face, and so on. The true being of a man is rather his deed. In this the individual is actual, and it is the deed that does away with both aspects of what is merely meant to be. In the one aspect where what is meant has the form of a corporeal passive being, the individuality in the deed exhibits itself rather as the negative essence, which only is insofar as it supersedes mere being. Then, too, the deed equally does away with the inexpressibility of what is meant in respect of the self-conscious individuality. In such mere opinion, the individuality is infinitely determined and determinable. In the accomplished deed, this spurious infinity is destroyed. The deed is something simply determined, universal, to be grasped in an abstraction. It is murder, theft, or a good action, a brave deed, and so on, and what it is can be said of it. It is this, and its being is not merely a sign, but the fact itself. It is this, and the individual human being is what the deed is. In the simplicity of this being, the individual is for others a universal being who really is, and who ceases to be something only meant. It is true that in the deed, he is not explicitly present as spirit, but when it is a question of his being qua being, and on the one hand, when the twofold being of bodily shape and deed are contrasted, each purporting to be what he actually is, then it is the deed alone that must be affirmed as his genuine being. Not his face or outward appearance, which is supposed to express what he means by his deeds, or what anyone might suppose he merely could do. Similarly, on the other hand, when his performance and his inner possibility, capacity, or intention are contrasted, it is the former alone which is to be regarded as his true actuality, even if he deceives himself on the point, and turning away from his action into himself, fancies that in this inner self he is something else than what he is in the deed. Individuality, when it commits itself to the objective element in putting itself into a deed, does of course risk being altered and perverted. But what settles the character of the deed is just this: whether the deed is an actual being that endures, or whether it is merely a fancied performance that in itself is nothing at all and passes away. The analysis of this being into intentions and subtleties of that sort, whereby the actual man, that is his deed, is to be explained away again in terms of a being that is only meant, just as the individual himself even may create for himself special intentions concerning his actuality, all this must be left to the laziness of mere conjecture. Should this idle thinking want to set its sterile wisdom to work, with the aim of denying the doer the character of reason, and so ill-using him as to declare that not his deed, but his face and lineaments are his real being, then it may expect to get the retort spoken of above, a retort which demonstrates that the face or outward appearance is not the individual's in itself, but, on the contrary, can be an object for handling. Hegel begins and ends paragraph 322 by bringing up some of Lichtenberg's remarks. Lichtenberg had considered the pseudoscience of physiognomy earlier than Hegel and had drawn some negative conclusions about it. Hegel is going to do this in a more systematic way. So he says, Lichtenberg says this: if anyone said, you certainly act like an honest man, but I can see from your face that you are forcing yourself to do so and are a rogue at heart, without a doubt, every honest fellow to the end of time, when thus addressed, will retort with a box on the ear, punching the guy in the head. And why so? Because something fundamental about the human being is being denied. And what we're going to get at is where the real being, the wahres Sein of the human being, or sometimes in the end passage, just Sein, where does that really reside? This is a key question. So he says that if this idle thinking, this is at the very end, wants to set its sterile wisdom to work with the aim of denying the doer, the individual human being, the doer, the person who's doing things, the character of reason, and so ill-using him as to declare that not his deed, but his face and lineaments, the way in which he is put together, the way in which he appears bodily to other people, are his real being, then it may expect to get the retort spoken of above, a retort that demonstrates that the face or outward appearance is not the individual's in itself, but on the contrary, can be an object for handling. So what Hegel is doing here is making a very clever joke that works on two levels. It's sort of a beginning and ending of the paragraph, but it also illustrates what the paragraph is talking about. If somebody wants to say, oh yeah, I can tell what kind of person you are, I know exactly how you're going to react, and then you go up and you just pop them one, right? You say, were you expecting that? There's something to that. What is that punching the other person, right? It is not simply the passive way in which the body exists, it's very active. Now you could say it's reactive, right? You get angry at the person, and maybe if you have, the criminal cast that a lot of people who are using this kind of research were particularly interested in. So, oh yeah, I expected that of you. But it would still, nonetheless, stem from the person's agency and freedom. And agency and freedom, which this is something we can generalize about human beings, at least when it's experienced some freedom, doesn't like other people taking away its freedom and showing it a fundamental kind of disrespect. So it responds, as Lichtenberg says, with a good punch in the ear, punching somebody in the side of the head, or maybe smacking them, that way. So why is Hegel saying this, putting jokes aside and funny images? What is he after here? He says that we have to consider where the real being, the wahres Sein, the true being of the person resides. So he says, what's going on is we've got a science of mere subjective opinion. We've already talked about this. Subjective opinion being, leeres Meinung, intention, saying that something is that way, asserting it, drawing conclusions about, the person's appearance. And this so-called science, this what we nowadays call pseudoscience, has been saying that the reality of a person is their face, or their clothing, or their skin color, or the bones, in their skull, or their genetics, and we can go on and on and on and on, right? So, what can we draw from this? That's what physiognomy is saying the real being of the person consists in. The real being also, what's inside the person, but that's gotten to from this outside. So he says, Hegel takes a different position. The true being of a person is rather their deed, their tat, what it is that they do. Their action is another way of translating this. Hegel, goes back and forth in sometimes how he discusses this in terms of several different synonyms. Tat, handeln. All these verbs have to do with action, with practice, with what a person commits themselves to doing, how they externalize their own being. So he says, the true being of a man is rather his deed. In this, the individual is actual. We only become actual as individuals by doing things in the world through the agency of our bodies. Our bodies are how we interact with the world. Hegel is an idealist, but that does not mean for a second that material things don't exist. It just means that they're also encompassed by spirit or mind. And he's going to talk here about a very important aspect of this, the universality of action. So he says it's the deed that does away with both aspects of what is merely meant to be. Again, this meinen, opinion we can call it, meaning, subjective opinion. What two aspects does it do away with? So he says the first is, in the one aspect where what is meant has the form of a corporeal, passive being. Right? The bodily appearance is what is meant by the interior of the person. This is going back to expression, right? The interiority of the individual, whatever that happens to be, their characteristics, their traits, their mind, their wishes, their wills, their whims, that's all somehow supposed to be expressed in something that we can see externally. So, we think about this in terms of emotions, right? I'm angry, right? Now, I can fake it, like I just did a second ago. Maybe that doesn't really reveal that much about the person. Or, I've been, told by some people that I look angry when I'm not angry. I know some people who, when they're thinking, they look angry or sad or happy when they're not feeling these emotions at all. And we can go further and further and further. Like somebody, maybe somebody has a mouth that droops down. Does that mean that they're really an unhappy person all the time because they frown so much that it's become part of their face? No, it could be their facial muscles are set up that way. And so it really doesn't signify what's within. And focusing on the action instead can allow us to draw our eyes away from that subjective and seductive misunderstanding of what the person is about. What's the other one? He says, the deed equally does away with that inexpressibility of what is meant in respect of the self-conscious individuality. People are expressing, there's something inside of me and I just have to get it out. Popular thing that we make fun of largely in movies. Strangely enough, is, you're going to write the next great American novel. I've got a novel in me. No, you only have a novel in you when it's actually coming out in writing, and then we can say you have a novel in you. Otherwise, you just have a wish to write a novel or some sort of batch of ideas that you think somehow might be turned into a novel or a screenplay, whatever you like, right? All of these things fall into the same sort of category of the intention, the Meinung, to be something, to do something, without actually doing it. So he goes on and he says, in such mere opinion, the individuality is infinitely determined and determinable. I should also point out, too, that we take, as he says a little bit later on, the bodily appearance as providing the meaning of the deed. So we see somebody do something, and then we say, I think we have to interpret it this way because they look like that sort of person. Now, what's going on there is Hegel says we're taking the person as being infinitely determined and determinable. That sounds kind of cool, doesn't it? Infinitely determined and determinable. Wow, it's like a feedback loop. Well, really it means totally arbitrary. You can't tell what's determining or what's determined, and anything can be anything you like. The only thing that's really determining in that case is the outside observer who's saying, oh yeah, I think that person's a criminal. Or, oh yeah, I think that criminal is actually a good guy. I can tell by looking at him that he didn't really mean to rape or kill or steal. He's probably a guy with good intentions, right? We'll give him a light sentence. We have cases like this all the time. Conversely, oh yeah, that guy's a rough type. I can tell that he's bad news. Full sentence for him. And let's see if we can place him somewhere downstate, away from his family. Oh, we can go on and on and on, right? Hegel wants to insist here, no, it's the deed. It's the action that really tells us what a person is. He says, in the accomplished deed, this spurious infinity is destroyed. This infinitely determined and determinable, we do away with that. If we really do pay attention to the deed, if we focus on that, and we treat it the way it's supposed to be treated, no more it's up to us. Now we get into the realm of the more objective. He says, the deed is something simply determined. Universal. This is the key there. The deed, which is an individual action carried out in a specific circumstance by a particular person, is at the same time universal. Universal in a way that bodily appearance is not universal. Universal in a way that even interiority of the individual is not universal. This is where we see, very starkly, Hegel's idealism is not an idealism that somehow just privileges mind over action, privileges mind over matter. It is one in which mind permeates both and only shows itself effectively in doing things, in actually taking stands. Now, thinking can be a kind of doing, but somewhere along the line, it's got to connect up with what we call the real world, or else it's, as he said earlier, a false kind of idealism. So he goes on and he says, he gives some examples. A murder, a theft, or a good action, a brave deed, and so on, are what can be said of it. And we come back again to the fact that language is what permits us to speak in terms of universals. A good deed on my part is a good deed, and it can be a different good deed than the good deed that you do, but we call them both good deed, and we call them based on what we actually see in the deed. There's subjective factors here, of course, but you get the idea. So he says, it is this, and its being is not merely a sign, but the fact itself. It is this, and the individual human being is what the deed is. You find out what a human being is through how they behave, not through their bodily appearance, not through something that you project back into them as a criminal mentality. You want to know if they're a criminal? Observe them, see if they do criminal actions. If you don't observe any criminal actions, maybe you should not call them a criminal type. Maybe you have to find another type. So he goes on and he says, in the simplicity of this being, the individual is for others a universal being who really is, and ceases to be something only meant. This is very important. Spirit is not found as this spirit here, this spirit here, this spirit here, this spirit here. It is something wider than an individual. But it's comprised of individuals in their relations to each other through time, in culture. That's what Hegel is ultimately aiming at in this phenomenology of spirit. It is displayed in actions, in deeds, in doing things, in commitments, in sacrifices, in prioritizations, in how these are reproduced. And that happens because of the inherent universality of action. So he goes on and he says, it's true that the deed is not explicitly present as spirit, but when it is a question of his being qua being, and on the one hand, the twofold being of bodily shape and deed are contrasted, each purporting to be what he actually is, it is the deed alone that must be affirmed as his genuine being, not his face, not his outward appearance, which is supposed to express what he means by his deeds. So often we take appearance as the cue for interpreting what a person is doing. We just said this already, right? This is where, because of its universality, the locus of meaning in a true sense ought to be found. Not meaning in the sense of pure subjective opinion or fancy or, sort of making stuff up as we go along and calling it a science, at least for the time being, until we prove it otherwise. So he goes on and he says, here we go. Similarly, on the other hand, where his performance and his inner possibility, capacity, or intention are contrasted, what are we talking about there? Performance is Werk. The performance is what the deed does. You might think also of the performance as being something that goes beyond the deed. It bears the traces of it, but it can also be what the deed leaves behind. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But when we contrast that with the interiority of the individual, with what he's called so far here, inner possibility, infinitely determinate and determinable, right? When people talk about inner possibilities and they don't determine it in some way, that's just, talk for I could be anything I want to be. Capacity. We have capacities for things. Intentions. Intentions seem to be, what we orient ourselves around. I have the intention to be a great philosopher and someday give the lecture at this university, right? Well, what'll tell if that's the case? Do I actually do the work that would be required? How do I act? Do I just sit around in my armchair and say, oh, wouldn't that be nice? Well, that's not a real intention. Real intentions show themselves in doing something. And we can say the same thing for loving. We can say the same thing for gratitude. We can say the same thing for opposing evil. We can go on and on about that sort of thing. So he says, when we contrast those, it's the former that's to be regarded as his true actuality. Even if the person deceives himself on that point. There's lots of people. Sartre will point this out later on, but he's just merely replicating what Hegel is saying here. People delude themselves all the time about who they are inside, by contrast to who they show themselves to be through their actions. Sometimes there's that disconnect too between their actions and how they physically appear to themselves to be. So he goes on and he says, if the person turns away from his action into himself, fancies that in his inner self he is something other than what he is in the deed, he's wrong about that. Individuality, when it commits to the objective element in putting itself into a deed, does in fact become vulnerable. It risks being altered and perverted. When you act, that doesn't mean that you don't act within a structural system where your action might actually get turned into something quite different. But your action is still your action. You do what you do. He says, what settles the character of the deed is just this. Whether the deed is an actual being that endures, this is again where we get to the performance or work, or whether it is a merely fancied performance that is itself nothing at all and passes away. Real deeds, significant of who the person is, last. They have a gripping within reality. So, well, wait a second. What about people who died and they did great things and everybody's forgotten them? Well, in a certain sense, they haven't been totally forgotten in this vast repository process of spirit. That's what Hegel would say. I personally think that that's not that great of an answer, but that's a question that can be left open at this point. So he goes on and he says, the analysis of the being into intentions and subtleties of that sort, whereby the actual man is to be explained away again in terms of a being that's only meant, just as the individual may create for himself special intentions concerning his actuality, all this must be left to the laziness of mere conjecture. And then we get back to this Lichtenberg thing. In doing so, we're not treating the other individual person as a real individual person who shows him or herself in their action. What if we want to express this in one, phrase? We should take actions more seriously than we do declared intentions or appearances.